Hey everyone, welcome back. We are the Breakpoint Show, and we are here to entertain you. And we're going to try to do that this week. Welcome, Khalid and Martin. It's good to see you guys on
Hey, Chris.
May
Hey, Chris.
6th. So 2 days past May the 4th. May the 4th be with you. So I forgot to post anything on that day. So
I posted a small rant. I mean, I get it, and it's fun if you're a fan of Star Wars, but I posted something saying git push forward, and it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I always like to post a picture of Mr. Spock on May the 4th. So, but that's just me trying to poke the bear. But and speaking of poking the bear, we're going to be talking about the state of open source in software development, but more focused on the .NET ecosystem. So there's good things and there's bad things that we're going to be speaking about. I hope we're going to be a little controversial to get people talking about this subject, but who knows? So we'll get started. But Khalid had some interesting thoughts before the show, and I said, time out, let's not go any further. Let's record these thoughts because Khalid has the nicest hair out of the three of us right now. And
we should get a haircut again.
Yeah, you guys need summer haircuts. So I know both of your wives just cut your hair.
Oh yeah,
I'm sure.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
absolutely.
I buzz my hair and then I leave a big patch, and then my wife sees it and says, "Hey, you missed a spot," but I'm like, I'm okay with it.
Yeah,
No
yeah.
one asks me.
When I went bald again, I had my wife help me with the back. So she's like, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And I'm like, "It's pretty much all gone on top, and I'm not a good-looking man like Patrick Stewart." So you guys know who Patrick Stewart is, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Captain Picard.
Make it so, Chris.
Make it so.
Make it so.
Make it.
But also, it all doesn't really matter that much because all we do is be in online meetings. So everything that counts is basically the front end and the back
I
end.
know. We just
Who cares if there's
front of
patches?
screens. So I have to say this. I posted this someplace on some chat, but the other day I got a LinkedIn message from a very expensive skincare company out of Mexico that was trying to pitch me skincare for people that sit in front of computer screens.
Huh.
And the very small amount of UV light that I actually get off of the screen, they said that you could get aging wrinkles. And I was like, I've already been 30 plus years in front of a computer screen. So if it hasn't affected me yet, then I'm okay. So, but I thought it was creative that someone's pitching skincare to people that sit inside in front of computer screens.
Yeah. I mean, I figure Martin's code has more of an effect on my aging than any light emitting from my screen.
It's all the NPM packages that you have to install with it.
You should see his if statements. Holy moly, what the heck? Now I'm just
You should
joking.
see his package.json files. So he just throws everything in. So I may use this, so throw it in and I'll use it later. But talking about open source, I mean, there is a lot of that. There is a lot of like you grab an open source project and you get everything else that it depends on. But Khalid, start us out because you had some wise thoughts this morning.
Yeah, so just to give people some context, I typically like to just go to NuGet.org and kind of see what packages people are uploading. So I'll go to NuGet and I'll sort by recently updated just to see what folks are kind of pushing out there. So I do this every once in a while, maybe like once a month, once every couple of weeks, just to kind of see what folks are developing, what they're thinking, what problems they're trying to solve. I do notice a lot of .NET is still stuck in this cyclical loop of people developing kind of their own quote unquote frameworks. And these frameworks include like 30 packages that are essentially wrappers around existing open source packages. So I get it, but it's also it's a lot of times it's like an opinion based framework that's really specific to that individual or the organization. So rarely are those packages actually helpful for the broader community. I mean, I'll ask you guys, when's the last time you went and found a full blown philosophical framework that you decide, okay, I'm going to use this to build my next solution? Is that something you do have ever done even?
Wow, I'm
Vue
caught on the spot here. Like
Vue.
nothing.
So Vue.js and
but I mean specifically in .NET.
Astro. I'm using Astro for a project coming up.
Yeah, so those are like, especially outside of .NET, are pretty common because people coalesce around those things. But specifically, like,
but in .NET, no, not really.
Yeah, I mean, the only one I can think of that I think is still kind of popular is the CLSA one, I think is what it's called.
Oh, Rockies.
Yeah.
So
that one,
CSLA is pretty popular. I mean, that's going on 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then this will age us. Patterns and practices was a big one at the time, but kind of like faded out. So I see a lot of those kind of packages. But as I was looking through NuGet, I also wanted to get an idea of like what packages people are actually downloading. So if you were to go to NuGet.org and scroll to the top in the navigation, you will see a statistics link. And if you click that, you'll see the top 100 community packages over the last 6 weeks. And we can talk about the top 5 here. Pretty straightforward. No surprises, I think. But so the first one is
no. Let's start from number 5 and work our way up.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do that.
So actually, number 5 is very surprising. Number 5 is Google's protobuf. So it seems like a lot of people, especially in the last 6 weeks, are doing a lot of gRPC. So that tells me people in .NET are likely building microservices, microservice solutions, and trying to optimize communication between those things. So that one's pretty cool. Number 4, Chris mentioned this before the podcast started. One of his favorites, Poly, is at number 4. So for folks do you want to describe what Poly is, Chris?
So Poly is used for resiliency. So imagine there's certain patterns that you can do for in your application, especially networked applications. Think about you have a client that's calling a server, and you call it and you get nothing back. Well, Poly can allow you to just set up a very generic way to, after so many seconds, try it again. And but it's not just that. And I can't remember all the patterns because my brain doesn't hold those things. If I need to know, I just look them up. But it's a lot of resiliency on not only on the client side, but also on the server side to help out with networked applications or networked communications.
Yeah, I think the name of the package Poly is kind of like, I think it's short for policies, like building resiliency policies. So it's kind of a clever play on words. Okay. The third most popular community package, I don't know if we would classify as community, but sure, it's not from Microsoft. It's the AWS SDK. So Surprisingly, a lot of folks are pushing their .NET solutions to AWS and kind of managing applications there. So, Martin, Chris, have you guys worked with AWS?
Yeah. Yep,
absolutely.
Yeah. One of my past employers was, and I won't say who, but they were a huge .NET company.
Mm-hmm.
But because they signed up for AWS before Azure came along, they are probably the biggest .NET company or biggest .NET user that puts stuff out on AWS. So, yeah,
it's also interesting to see that package, which is AWS SDK.core, because that package is dependent on by all of the specific services that you have in AWS. So if you want to work with S3, that's the storage service, or with Lambdas, for example, if you want to do serverless and so on, this package is part or a dependency of the SDK that is specific to that service. So it's interesting to see none of the other packages from AWS show up in that in the top 10 or top 20 even. But seeing this one does give you a good idea that there's a lot of AWS in the .NET world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there is. And I know a lot of AWS people at AWS that like .NET is huge on their infrastructure.
Yep. So the second one, I think the second one has a lot of momentum just based on like .NET history. I'll say what it is, but I also noticed that essentially a competitor / replacement is slowly rising up the list here. But number 2 is Serialog. So for folks who don't know, actually, Martin, you're using Serialog. Do you want to explain what Serialog is and what are its benefits?
Yeah, so Serialog is like many logging frameworks. It does logging where you have different severities where you can do debug logging or error logging or just warnings or information and all of that. But an interesting thing is that Serialog kind of came up with this idea in the .NET world of doing semantic logging, where your log message is not just a simple string, but you can actually add objects or specific named properties to the log message that you are sending. So for example, if you're working with, say, customer data, and you have a customer ID 123, you could add a property called customer ID with the value 123 to your log messages. And then with Serialog, you can just see the strings like you would do with any other logging framework as well. But depending on where you are logging to, which sync you are using, could be Elasticsearch, could be Seek, could be Application Insights, could be whatever. You can actually look at those properties as well and filter the log messages to specific properties of the objects that you are logging. So if you want to see all of the log messages from the last 5 minutes for customer 567, that is possible with something like Serialog, and of course the supporting sync there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Serialog is pretty cool, and it's definitely one of those older packages that is mature, is capable, and you do see it in a lot of enterprise solutions even today. So, but the thing I wanted to mention is, logging, the way you described it is very it's very based on like an instance in time. So an event happens, you log it, and there's kind of this fire hose aspect to logging that I think over time people realized with growing complexity of solutions, and we talked about gRPC and microservices, logging becomes very, very difficult to use to kind of diagnose issues in your solution. So at 42 in this list, we start to see OpenTelemetry kind of work its way up. And I'm curious if OpenTelemetry and traces kind of move their way up closer to where Serialog is over time. That said, it has to beat the momentum of Serialog and all these years. So, but it's interesting to see those two kind of in the top 100 together, at least. So, any thoughts before we move on to number 1? Because number 1 is probably not surprising to anybody.
Let's do number one.
That's number one. Yeah, just throw it out.
All right. So number one, no surprise to anyone probably listening right now, but it is newtonsoft.json. So JSON's still king. People want to serialize their data into JSON. They want to read data from JSON into C# objects. And the proliferation of newtonsoft.json as a dependency, either direct or transitive, it's all over .NET, and it's no surprise that it's easily the top number one package at 200 million downloads in the last 6 weeks.
Here's the thing we also talked about before the show started. None of this has any open source projects that Microsoft maintains, like EF Core or system.json, which was built by the person who wrote the number one package, Newtonsoft. So I'm sure system.json is probably as big or maybe bigger, and
it's actually quite interesting.
Yeah, go ahead.
We were indeed talking about this before the episode, and it's not super obvious, but also it is kind of obvious if you think about it. But on the statistics page on NuGet, you can also click Show All Packages, and that will include the Microsoft packages there as well. And I was just clicking that, and it's interesting to see that on number 8 of that top 100 packages, there's system.text.json with 200 million downloads. And on place 9 is newtonsoft.json with 191 million downloads. So they're very close together.
Yeah. So which one? I mean, and for most people, they view those interchangeably. I try to lean towards the newer one, just because it's a little more performant and doesn't have all the features, but it runs a little quicker.
I will say system.text.json has evolved since like its initial release. So for me, it's a lot easier to use and to move to today than it was when it initially released, because I think the initial release was really focused on performance and memory allocation. And it was very it was about immutability and creating these like writing patterns that were predictable. So it didn't lend itself to, say, easily at least, to building dynamic JSON objects on the fly, or being a little bit more flexible when it comes to like handling data, right? So null objects and things like that were very explodey in the initial versions of system text JSON, but I find it's a lot better today than it was. So I think that transition, it makes sense that at least system text JSON is starting to overtake Newtonsoft in the downloads. It is funny though. The number one Microsoft package is the dependency injection abstractions. So it's like dependency injection, to no surprise, is here to stay for a lot of people, and is probably very important in building .NET applications.
So is that with dependency injection built into ASP.NET Core, would that be for .NET Framework, or is that referencing the underlying technology for ASP.NET Core?
This particular package is Microsoft.extensions.dependencyinjection.abstractions. So I'm guessing it's the interfaces of like iService Locator and things like that. So it would make sense that would be higher, because maybe people are still using older, more mature dependency injection libraries. Like what's one that's used today?
Ninject,
Autofac.
Autofac. Yeah.
So people are still using those just because they're more powerful and have more, you know, more capabilities than the built-in stuff. So
Yeah, they're more flexible.
yeah.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting. The trend that I see in a lot of these packages, just kind of grouping them and thinking about them logically. If I had to describe what I think the most likely .NET application is out there that people are working on and building, it's most likely a backend or web-based technology solution. So ASP.NET Core, or they're building service workers that run on servers and
Web APIs.
Web APIs. That's a good one. And just kind of accessing data stores or communicating out information through some kind of messaging protocol, whether it's gRPC or HTTP or something like that. So
one additional interesting thing there to see is that indeed gRPC is there, protobuf is there, and so on. So the backend scenario is definitely a thing. At the same time, looking at like the top 30, there's a lot of XUnit in there. So I think a lot of people are actually writing unit tests for those. And it looks like XUnit is the most popular framework there, or at least the most downloaded.
Yeah. I would probably say it's both.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take a look at people's GitHub repositories, I see, and I'll scan through projects on there. I see probably 2-to-1, 3-to-1 XUnit to anything else.
Mm-hmm.
So, but
yeah. One last thing before we kind of move on from this list. If you scroll down to the bottom with show all packages, you'll notice that the last 5 packages are focused on cryptography, specifically OpenSSL on Linux. So you have Fedora, OpenSUSE, OS like Mac OS, OS X, Debian, and Ubuntu there. So it's also pretty clear that a lot of folks are deploying their .NET solutions onto Linux hosts, whether that's directly say Azure Application Services on a Linux host, or they're Dockerizing their .NET solutions on Linux containers. So that's kind of cool. Yeah, it's cheaper.
A lot
like
cheaper.
Why pay those licensing costs if you're just running a headless application like a service or web application?
Yeah,
it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Or another one of my favorite sort of open source, and we'll probably get into this. Sort of open source is and Service Bus.
Mm-hmm.
I love that's a great. It's open source, but it has a business license with it. So I don't know if we'll get into that, but with everything that's been happening over the last couple of weeks, that might be a good topic to jump into also at the end.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a good segue in terms of to ask you guys, like, how do you feel generally about the state of open source in .NET? What's working? What maybe isn't working for folks? And what do you think, like, if you had a crystal ball, what do you think the next 5 years entails for open source in .NET?
I'll let Martin go first.
That's a loaded question if I've ever had one.
Yeah. All right, go ahead, Martin.
I'll try and answer part of it, and you just keep grilling me until you're satisfied with what comes out. I think there's definitely open source in .NET. There's definitely new projects being started. There's people experimenting with things, publishing them to NuGet and so on. So there's definitely vibrancy there. However, that hasn't really changed or increased to my knowledge from the old .NET framework days where we had alt.NET and people just doing the exact same thing. What has changed though since those days is that .NET Core became open source, .NET itself became open source, the BCL, the framework, and all of that. And ironically, one of the things that I've noticed, and I think you can probably keep track of that using those NuGet statistics as well, is that by having an open source framework and everything available to look at and install and whatnot, but also the framework adopting things like logging, like dependency injection and so on, even if it all supports plugging in custom providers, an interesting side effect of that all becoming open source is that I feel, or I see in customer implementations and just random projects on the internet, that there is less open source usage of those components that plug into that pipeline. So dependency injection, for example, yes, AutoFac is still around. I see it every once in a while, but it looks like that has become a second choice after just using the default that sits in .NET Framework.
Yeah.
So is there open source? Absolutely. Is it vibrant? No idea what the threshold for the word vibrant should be, but there's definitely open source. But the irony is that the open sourcing of the framework has actually resulted in, I think, less adoption of some of the open source out there.
You know what? I think you're right. But there are still lots of open source projects that are being used and being touted for what they do. It's just the problem is that I don't think very many people are getting involved in kind of open source isn't just about the software, it's about the culture and the community. And I don't think .NET, and I'll say it, I just don't think .NET, our community, has as much of that culture built into it and thriving in it to really even more vibrant. And what I mean is, if you take a look at JavaScript and a lot of the I'll say open web stack, you get a lot more people, or at least it seems to me there's a lot more people that help and give back to open source and stuff like that, where I just don't see like as much of that, as much source code PRs back to open source projects, and people actually people use the open source software. I just don't think that they take a look at it and try to make it better.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I will say .NET was born and bred inside of the enterprise bubble, right? So it makes a lot of sense that it's a lot harder to build community across organizations when those organizations are potentially competing in the same marketplace. Again, this .NET is very business focused from that perspective. It's clear just even looking at the packages, the packages are geared towards enterprise solutions and scalable apps, whereas some of the communities you mentioned, Chris, like JavaScript, there's a variety and diversity of problems people are trying to solve, from enterprise the whole way down to, I just want a static website with some HTML on it, and I want to express myself, my individuality, through this technology choice that I'm choosing in this ecosystem. So that diversity creates a more healthy community, whereas in .NET, I think we're all kind of focused on solving business solutions most of the time and delivering business value. And that creates an echo chamber, I think. So
exactly. Yeah. And it's not, I mean, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying it's not, I mean, our community in .NET is really good at being what it is. Mm-hmm. It's just that part of open source just hasn't really gripped the .NET community, and people aren't really doing it now. There are people that are in the .NET community that help out and give PRs when they find bugs and help in different ways. And one example is Microsoft has kind of, I don't think it's open source, but they've opened the documentation for .NET so people can help out with the documentation, which I find is a open source spirit. I don't know if it's clear, like an open source defined like work, but it's still, for me, it still reminds me of that spirit of open source.
Yeah. Good, Martin.
The documentation, that's a funny thing. I was actually looking at the license for that the other week, and it is an open source license. So the source code for the documentation, the entire documentation engine and so on, is all MIT licensed, so very, very permissive. The content of the documentation, so anything talking about .NET, about Azure and so on, is typically under a Creative Commons license where attribution is required. So if you want to reuse part of that, you need to attribute, of course, where you found this information. But other than that, it's pure open source, which means that you can contribute, you can suggest changes, you can talk about things. However, and I think this is an important one that a lot of users or a lot of consumers of open source don't understand, is that the project owner can still decide where the project wants to go. So if all of a sudden, imagine I'm from AWS and I'll write documentation about AWS tools on the Azure documentation, Microsoft, the project owner there, is free to say, no, that's not something we want to publish here. However, if you make a typo or you want to expand the documentation on how, say, data protection ASP.NET Core works, they will probably accept that and they will be happy with your contributions.
Yeah. I don't know if we should mention the latest drama that's happening, because I'm sure it'll be dated, but I guess there's a heavy discussion around the documentation of having GitHub Copilot ads in the middle of the .NET documentation. Some people are like, it's fine. Some people are like, why are you doing this? So to your point, Martin, it's like, I think maybe this adds to the whole open source .NET discussion, which is like, you always have to take a step back and remind yourself, like, .NET is a product owned by the Microsoft Corporation, and any contribution you make is Microsoft's, like, they own it, right? So maybe that kind of dampers people's enthusiasm to contribute to the ecosystem, because in a way it's like, it kind of, all this energy gets funneled back into this megacorp. And we see it with a lot of open source maintainers, is like, maybe they don't get the value back that they put in to their projects or to the community or the ecosystem.
Yeah. Well, I'll you know what? I'll be a defender of Microsoft for
How
a
dare you
minute.
start? No, I'm just going.
And I will say, you know what? From my standpoint, I think they do a good job. What basically is probably the biggest open source product in the world right now is VS Code, which I don't use, but plenty of people do for .NET. And I mean, I think it's probably a bigger product for outside of .NET. In the world of just this open web kind of stack community. So and if you really take a look at it, and it's really surprising that Microsoft did VS Code, because it does eat at the revenue of potentially the full Visual Studio product. Now, granted, that's Windows only, and VS Code runs on the three major operating systems in the world, just like JetBrains Rider, but JetBrains Rider is that mixed license. So now it's free for non-commercial use, but if you use it for commercial, you got to pay for it. VS Code is just use it and do stuff with it. So.
Yeah, I mean, I will say it's a little complicated when it comes to VS Code because most of it is open source, but ironically, when it comes to C# and .NET development, the dev kit requires a Visual Studio license. So I think overall, there's always this balancing act between wanting to provide as many people value, because let's face it, when it comes to programming, the majority of people doing programming are likely hobbyists. They're not doing it professionally. They're either writing a script here or there, or they're dabbling in web development, or they're dabbling in game development and stuff like that. So I would say the majority of people doing software development probably aren't professionals, maybe even students, throw them in. So there's always that kind of trying to balance that act. But I don't know. So maybe this is a good time to start talking about, we're all, we grew up in the open source era of .NET, and obviously we have packages we all reach for. Do you guys have any open source packages that you think are underrated, more people should know about, that maybe you found super helpful recently and want to tell people about?
I'll start with one. I think they are a little bit of an unsung hero. Actually, there's two. Can I have two?
Sure, you can have two.
In many applications, whether line of business or any web application or whatever, there's two things that very often have to be done. One is generating PDFs, and the other one is working with data imports, and typically that's like a CSV file coming from Excel and so on. And my two favorite projects are in that realm. So for PDF creation, there is the excellent Quest PDF. I think they started with a commercial license now as well, but they are fantastic. They have great documentation, a really nice fluent API to build any type of document where you have images or tables or text or whatever. And then CSV Helper is like the Swiss Army knife for CSV import. It allows you to specify how you want to look at delimiting the fields in your CSV file, reading line by line, for example, so you don't load 100 megabytes of customer data, for example, in one go. It's super flexible in terms of cultures, in terms of parsing numbers and currency values and so on. So I would definitely say have a look at those. They're fantastic.
Yeah,
so I'll do two. I'll do two, and okay.
I just want to let
feedback. Okay.
Well, no, I want to. Surprisingly, I was looking at the top 100. CSV Helper is number 54 on NuGet with 14 million downloads, which actually I think is kind of shockingly low for how good that package is. So. And my other comment before I let Chris go, can people out there tell that Martin is a manager with his professing his love for PDF files and spreadsheets? Yeah.
Well, he's also old if he's talking about CSV. So.
All right, Chris, sorry, I apologize. I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, I've got two. And one is help maintain. It was created by someone that's here on the podcast. And that is Khalid is a big, he helped create HTMX.net, and which is a great wrapper around HTMX, which is a very small JavaScript library that will help people with better server-side web development. So that's my first one.
I was for a second thinking there that you would mention my CSV library for PHP, but I will second, by the way, htmx.net is fantastic. I had that in my list to talk about as well, but I didn't want to self-promote the three of us, but it's a great library.
I'll give Cleed his due. So I pick on Cleed, but Cleed's a very smart developer. So I love his blog.
Yeah.
The other one.
Before you continue, I
okay.
will say it's been surprising seeing people write blog posts about htmx.net just generally without me, slipping them a big briefcase of cash. So it is kind of neat to see it kind of pick up in the .NET community.
Yeah.
So thank you folks for acknowledging that. All right, go ahead, Chris.
I'll be writing a couple chapters on it for my online book covering ASP.NET Core and HTMX. But the one that I always come back to and I always bring into pretty much any project, server side or web, like a web development, is Fluent validation. It is the most, for me, it's the most beautiful project, and it's some of the best code, and it allows me to not have to decorate my C# classes with nasty annotations, which I hate annotations in .NET. So that's just my personal take. And it also allows me to have a more flexible validation story for my projects.
Yeah, I really, Fluent validation is one of my favorites too. I think once you start building applications at scale, I think the most powerful part of Fluent validations for me is just the idea of rule sets. So the ability to have one data transfer object or DTO or a request response kind of model, but having flexibility to say, okay, when this object comes in from this endpoint, I want to validate based on this rule set or that rule set. So it helps reduce the amount of code that you ultimately have in your solutions, but have that logical flexibility. I think that is really cool.
Yeah. Well, and I got one more why I love it is because I can actually write unit tests against the validation rules.
Mm-hmm.
And I love it because of that. I can actually test validation to make sure that my logic is sound or my team's logic is sound when it comes to validating.
I will say, if you want to learn more about this framework, Fluent validation, we do have a dedicated episode on validation as a whole. So I would definitely recommend everyone listening or watching on YouTube to also check out that episode.
Yeah, I'll put a link. I'm gonna write a note. I'll put a link in the show notes back to that episode.
Okay. All right. We are coming up on time here, so maybe that was a good time to kind of wrap up. Like, do you guys have any general thoughts of like we asked like, what do you think the next 5 years of open source is going to look like in .NET? Try to be hopeful. Let's give people a hope out there.
So I think a lot of people are joining .NET and starting out with .NET, and I think everyone who is joining a new ecosystem is typically also quite enthusiastic about what's going on and will start playing around with things. So I don't think there will be any shortage of new open source and new ideas floating about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Chris, do you have any?
The one last thing I want to say is I want to thank Andrew Locke for actually making me feel good about pushing this podcast out every 2 weeks, because he actually has written some blog posts around one of our episodes, our dependency injection episode and talked about some of the different kinds of dependency injection scenarios that we talked about that aren't covered in the generic built-in stories for ASP.NET Core. So I want to say thank you to Andrew for
Absolutely,
writing those, and I think he actually wrote an implementation for the pooling.
Yep, that's his recent blog post.
Allow people to build pools in dependency injection for ASP.NET Core.
Yeah.
So
big thank you to him. That was a fun episode. Maybe a future episode we'll imagine things that could be in .NET. Give Andrew something to write about or imagine. I'll try to go a little crazier, but maybe that's a good note in terms of what I feel in terms of open source in .NET. You know, the thing that's always driven open source in .NET has typically been the gaps that Microsoft can't or won't fill. So I'm excited to see more people try to fill those gaps. One of my big ones that I still want to see a community build around is static site generation inside of .NET. It's so close. I'm telling you, it's so close, and it would do so much.
Steady. They're static.
There's
STATIQ. But that's pretty rigid in what it spits out. So
I like static. Don't get me wrong. I think static. Maybe we get into this in another episode, but sometimes the problem with .NET solutions is they're very like C# heavy. And I think what I want is solutions that help people deliver like things without having to invest so heavily into C#.
Yeah.
And that's it. I just want to see more solutions to things that maybe are missing rather than a lot of reinventing the wheel.
Yeah.
Which is kind of how we started this episode. So,
well, and you know what? I want to get, I wish people would take a look at the heroes that I view in .NET open source. And those are like Jimmy Bogard, even though he has taken some projects and wrapped business licensing around it. And,
I don't fault him for that.
But I don't fault him for it at all. You got to make money. But he has contributed a lot of his knowledge and energy to our community. Another one is Jeremy Miller, who seems to push out an open source project one every couple months. His new one's Wolverine, which is like a messaging open source project. Very cool, very awesome and take a look at that one. But there are unsung heroes out there that try to help out the community. So,
yep. All right.
Cool.
On that note, I think that's it for this episode.
Okay.
Yeah, if you haven't already, go like and subscribe.
Go
push up, hit that bell.
Yeah, I forgot to do that in the beginning. So, but if you reach this far, you're a fan, go subscribe. Let us know some topics. Let us know guests that you like on the show. Maybe we'll get Andrew Locke on the show. So
if he's open for it, I'd love to have him.
I would love to get Andrew on the show. But yeah. So we'll be back in 2 weeks and have a good part of May, and hopefully everything is good where everyone is at. So thank you.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.